Today I have a special guest, Mark Sanborn. Welcome to our show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Great. And joining us today also, my co-host is Dan Forbes, the founder of Leadwood Giants Community. Good morning to you. You're down there from, well, my state, Texas, so welcome.
Yeah, the great state of Texas. Hanging out from Austin. Good to be with you, Tal, Mark, and Liz. Great.
Awesome. Liz, welcome to our show as well out there in Utah.
Thanks, Tal. Excited to be here with Mark, so fantastic.
Great. Well, we're thrilled to have Mark on our show. We recently hit a couple of customer service experts on our show, and Mark is definitely one of the top speakers in that arena and one of the top leadership speakers in the world. So we're thrilled to have you on our show, Mark.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. Let me give a brief introduction about Mark in case you haven't seen his work or you haven't heard about him. He's out there definitely for sure. But let me give a brief introduction. Mark is the author of 8 books, including the bestseller The Fred Factor, How Passion in Your Work and Life Can Turn the Ordinary into Extraordinary, which has sold more than 1.6 million copies internationally. His other books include You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader, How Anyone Anywhere Can Make a Positive Difference, Team Built, Making Teamwork Work, The Encore Effect, How to Achieve Remarkable Performance in Anything You Do, Up and Down or Sideways, How to Succeed When Times Are Good, Bad, or In Between. And his last book was Fred 2.0, New Ideas on How to Keep Delivering Extraordinary Results, which was released in March 2013. Mark, are you working on a new book that we need to be aware of?
I'm in the early stages of a new book. Until I get a publisher to buy it, I can't officially say I'm working on it, but I do have the concept for a new book about how the best continue to get better. And if all goes well, that will be the forthcoming release that I am able to put out.
All right. Well, you definitely have an audience in the market for that. You've been successful with your books, and I know that in the customer service industry, the Fred Factor is definitely a bestseller, and we constantly look at that stuff every day. So let's dive in. Mark, in Fred 2.0, you talk about Fred's philosophy of service. Why is it so important, not only in customer service, but just in life? What I took away from the Fred Factor and reading both the Fred Factor and Fred 2.0 was it's really a philosophy of life. Can you share with us why is it so important to customer service?
It's interesting. I think most people that bought and read the Fred Factor and Fred 2.0 saw them as customer service books, and certainly I understand that. But one of the things that I talk about in the new book, Fred 2.0, is that I didn't write the book as a customer service book. I wrote it as kind of a business or simple life philosophy book because I believe that although the Fred Factor is always about service, the people who practice it aren't always in a traditional customer service role. All of us can embrace the idea of adding value to our work and making a bigger, more positive difference to others, whether or not we're in the service sector, whether we're a manager or whether we're in healthcare or law or education or whatever position in life we may hold. I wanted to write about 4 principles that I thought guided all businesses, and frankly, they can be applied in your personal life because truth is always transferable. You know, what's true at home is true at work, and the only thing that changes is perhaps the application of the underlying principle. But it was most embraced by people who want to provide a superior experience for the customer, and it's been gratifying that for that and other reasons we've had a lot of people embrace the Fred Factor philosophy.
It's great, and I want to read a really powerful quote from the Fred Factor, the first book, and it really what it comes down to as I rehashed and kind of reread those books, it came down to this, and I want to read this powerful quote that you share. The quality of the relationship determines the quality of the product and service. And so what went through my mind was it really boils down to cultivating, nurturing, having a servant heart. Those relationships are key, and the reason I say this is because, Mark, you talk about grocery store experience, you talk about retail experience, sometimes hotel experience. The relationship is it's either taken for granted or it's non-existent. What do you think?
Well, there's 2 things in life that we don't typically get taught. Number one, we don't get taught how to raise kids. You know, by the time we think we figured it out, they're grown up. The other thing that we don't typically get taught is how to build relationships at home or at work. And so one of the key principles that you mentioned, it's all about relationship, meant that I needed to teach what I would call basic relationship building 101. Now, I've modified my view a little bit more for clarification than because my view has changed. But depending on how much time you interact with a customer or a client, you might not always have a chance to build what we would call a relationship. You know, if it's a fleeting period of time, if it's an interaction, what I think the goal should be is to connect. Now, for the long term, if you have an ongoing relationship with a customer, that should be the goal, is to build and improve on the relationship. But even in those fleeting moments when we just have a brief time with another human being, there's a difference between being indifferent and providing a service and truly connecting with them in that moment so that they know that we truly care, not just about the product or service, but about them and the problem that we can solve for them or the success that we can help create. So I look at kind of a hierarchy. At the lowest level, the undifferentiated level is an interaction. In limited time, the goal is to go from an interaction to a connection. If you have ongoing contact with that client or customer, the ultimate goal is to deepen the relationship.
That's very inspiring what you just shared with us, because that's really elevating that customer experience to a new level where it's not ordinary, it's extraordinary by those cultivating those relationships and thinking in terms of relationships rather than a transaction. So that's really important. Let me also have Dan and Liz join into the conversation. So I'm sure you guys have some questions for Mark.
Well, maybe the lady would like to go first.
That's customer service.
Yeah. So, Mark, someone is always watching us, and we may not be interacting with them directly. Can you talk a little bit maybe about how we can monitor our behavior at all times so that we can be making a positive impact even if we're not interacting directly?
Carly Fiorina, who of course is a presidential candidate officially or unofficially and was formerly the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, once said that leadership is a performance. And I like that quote, not because she meant you were an actor on a stage pretending to be whom you're not, but because a performance is something that we have to continually give our attention to. You know, we're always on stage, and as you mentioned, we're often observed in times when we don't know the impact or the influence that we're having on other people. So I think the key is simply to be alert to the fact that everything we do has the potential to make a positive or a negative difference. And ultimately, the goal of any leader, whether or not they have a title, should be to be a positive influence, to exemplify how we should be, not to exemplify how not to be. So I think it's all about awareness. It's about being sensitive to the fact that when you lose your temper in traffic, you never know who else might recognize you. I've certainly goofed up and been checking into a hotel and had a disagreement at the front desk only to realize that some of the other people behind me in line might be at the meeting I was speaking to or at the meeting I was a part of. So I think it is important to realize that we're always on stage, not pretending to be who we're not, but choosing to be our best selves. Because we all have a higher and a lower nature, you know, a noble nature and a base nature. And I think leaders try as much as possible to be their best selves.
Great advice. Thank you for sharing that.
So, Mark, got a copy of your book here.
Oh, great.
Loved it. And I know it's been around for a while, and we didn't really set the context about Fred and the first book, you know, who Fred is. Maybe you could just briefly remind us about the basis of the first book, Fred. And then my question is, how could you tell a story or share an illustration of actually how companies and how businesses have used the Fred factor and implemented perhaps creating an army of Freds within their organization?
Fred Shea, who just retired a couple of years ago from the United States Postal Service after more than 30 years of service, is an inspiring individual in that he had what some people might consider a very simple and even redundant job, you know, delivering the mail. But he did it in such an extraordinary way. He found so many ways to add value and to get to know and help his customers that I was so impressed that I used his example as the centerpiece for the first book, The Fred Factor. And the underlying theme of all my work has been the same, and that is that nobody can prevent you from choosing to be extraordinary. And I think what's interesting about Fred Shea is that if Fred was able to bring so much artistry to delivering the mail, then there's no excuse for any of us who have at least that much, if not much more opportunity in our own work. You know, I didn't write a book about Bill Gates or Warren Buffett because, of course, they have more money than most anybody else on the planet. And it would be very easy to say, well, you know, if I had that kind of money, I could be that kind of an influencer as well. Fred was, like all of us, an ordinary individual, but he chose to do an extraordinary job. And that's really our challenge. How do we take ordinary minutes and make them extraordinary? And, you know, there have been a lot of companies that have taught these principles and practices, but one of my favorite examples is a dentist in Lorain, Ohio, named Dr. Matt Messina. I write about him in Fred 2.0. And he and his staff found that a lot of their older patients in their 80s and 90s didn't have living relatives or families to celebrate their birthdays. So if one of these patients made an appointment to come in for a teeth cleaning anytime near their birthday, they would inventory party supplies and throw just a little impromptu birthday party for them. And of course, not only was that touching because it meant a lot to these patients, you know, it was truly not only a value add, but proof that they value the relationship. But what they found is that these older patients started scheduling their dental appointments on their birthdays. So what I like about that example is there was no big budget involved, maybe a little bit for cupcakes and candles and whatever else they used for the celebration. But mostly what it was about was thoughtfulness. And I think that that's probably the one thing that derails many people from being a more effective leader or providing better service. And that is if we're going 100 miles an hour with our hair on fire, we usually don't spot or make time to take advantage of those little opportunities that make a big difference to others.
That's great. You know, let's shift a little bit of a perspective for people who are leaders and managers in their organization from a leadership perspective. Mark, how do we grow and develop the next Fred?
Well, I'll give the listeners today an acronym. And I know acronyms can sometimes seem a little bit trite or hackneyed, but they're still a great memory device. And I think for anyone that wants to embrace the philosophy, you know, whether or not they use the same terminology that I use in the Fred Factor, and often the terminology I use is for fun, but I'm more concerned with whether or not people embrace the philosophy than whether or not they embrace the vocabulary. But if you take the word Fred, there's basically 4 steps to having more people like Fred in your employ. The first is you've got to find the ones you've already got. Because there are a lot of people who do good work, but they get ignored because they do good work and we don't have to worry about them. And instead we devote our time to the underperformers or, you know, the poor performers. And we, as Peter Drucker used to say, inadvertently feed our problems and starve our opportunities. You know, we focus on what's wrong instead of what's right. Now we still need to focus on what's wrong and needs to be fixed, but we should never do that at the expense of not rewarding and recognizing those people who do a great job. So I always say if you want to have more Freds in your organization, pay attention to the ones you've already got. And the R in Fred is for reward and recognize. That's that reinforcement. I say the difference between recognition and reward is that recognition is non-monetary, it's intangible, it's a good word or a pat on the back, whereas a reward would be anything from a bonus to a Starbucks gift card or a movie certificate. But the point is you get the behavior that you recognize and reward, and that's so important because managers get busy and often that falls off their radar in terms of what they do on a daily basis. They've got to be good noticers. The E, so important, is to educate people on how to do it. My friend Dr. Nito Cobain, who's the president of High Point University, once said it so well when he said, expectation without education equals frustration. If you just tell people to do an extraordinary job, but you don't give them any training or any resources or any education, if they don't know how to do it, no matter how motivated they are, they're not going to be able to deliver. And that's why education is so important to this process. And that's really one of the main reasons that I wrote Fred 2.0 was that many companies and clients said, you know, we've used all of the principles in the Fred factor, and there are 4, but we want to go deeper and wider. And really, I always look at the Fred factor as kind of entry level, and Fred 2.0 is the graduate course. But in that acronym, find, reward, and recognize, and educate, the most important, in my opinion, of the 4 keys is the last. And the D is for demonstrate. Because if you aren't willing to be a living example of what you want others to be, they'll know that at worst it's hypocrisy, and at best it's incongruence. So you need to be able to first and foremost be a Fred so that people can see a living example rather than just read about it in a book or hear about examples third hand. So those are the 4 keys, and certainly they're easy to say, but they take a good deal of attention and effort to truly implement well.
Yeah, and then speaking of Peter Drucker, I think in the book, The Effective Executive, he talks about how people, you can't just spend 15 minutes with people, you have to spend some hours to develop the people and be with your people if you're a great leader. So the very valuable information, and I look at your work, sort of body of work with Fred Factor and Fred 2.0 as kind of the forerunner right now, because a lot of brands out there with the social media presence out there, I think customer service has become the thing right now that brands want to differentiate themselves with other companies, other businesses. Customer service has become kind of the element that can be a competitive advantage to some companies. Do you think that customer service over the years has gotten better or it's gotten worse?
Well, there's actually an index that you can find online. University of Michigan and the American Society of Quality Control, I believe, has for some years published the Customer Service Index. And what's fascinating to me, last time I checked, is that there hasn't been a great deal of change in most sectors. I think they track 20-plus sectors, so you can see by sector how service levels are improving or not improving. What's amazing to me is that even though there's been a little bit of improvement, it hasn't been significant. And why I find that puzzling is because when you look at all the money and attention that so many companies seem to be investing in improving customer service or client relations, you would think that it would bump the needle a little bit more. Of course, I guess you could make the case that those good companies really are getting much better while their industry sector stays the same. So maybe there is a bump in the competitive advantage that those that do it right enjoy. I think the problem is there's a real tension between using technology to become more efficient and using it correctly to build at least connections, if not relationships. So many companies make it so hard to interact and so convoluted that even a simple online form can take 10 minutes to fill out, at which point at about minute 2 you figure, well, forget it. I'm not going to give them the feedback. I'm not going to ask the question. I'm just going to go somewhere else. And I think that technology, obviously, and I'm a big believer in using technology well, but I think we need to remember that technology should never replace ingenuity. It should only leverage it. And we've got to make it easy for people to do 2 things, be heard and get what they need. And if you can do that with technology in a time-efficient manner, and you can, at the same time, give people who want that personal relationship, who want to do business with a human being and not an automated call center or an internet website, that you give them that choice so that it's an and, not an either or. Because I think that's one of the Achilles tendons today is so many businesses that are trying to offload their service function to technology, and very few of them, in my opinion, do it very well.
No, you're very right on that, because I want to mention something with that, because in the hotel business, some of the services are going to mobile devices and things like that. But luckily, I work in a company and a brand that hones the Fred Factor principle, which is building their relationships. And I think that that's what gets underestimated, and that's why I think it hasn't really moved the needle, is because, as you alluded to earlier, the relationship course is a life course, and sometimes you have to learn through the servant's heart and their relationships. What I really like about the Fred Factor as I went through it is that it's just really family kind of oriented principles that are used, and Fred didn't go to this big universities or big corporate companies. He understood really the foundation of great service.
Well, at some level, it's commonsensical, except that evidently it isn't really common sense, or more people would embrace it. When I was having breakfast with Fred once, he was traveling with me to an event. He said something that, in retrospect, kind of floored me. He said, "Mark, doesn't everybody do their work this way?" And I said, "Well, Fred, if they did, nobody'd buy and read the book." But evidently, that kind of simple, not simplistic, but basic, simple approach that Fred takes to doing business and to living his life is something that somehow we've lost track of, or it's gotten pushed to the back burner, or it's been displaced with something else. I think that what is encouraging is that Fred doesn't overthink it. I once asked him, I said, how do you give such great service to all the customers on your route? And he said, well, I don't think of them as customers. I just think of them as friends, and it's easy to take care of your friends. Now, the cynic would instantly go, well, I don't want to be friends with all my customers. That's not what Fred said. Fred said, think of them as friends, because that guides you then in how you interact. The example I use is that if you're behind someone in traffic who's just, in your opinion, driving badly, and you decide to give them some feedback by blowing your horn, if they look in the rearview mirror and suddenly it's not just somebody driving badly, but somebody you know, your attitude shifts. They're still crappy drivers, but all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's my friend Bob. Hey, Bob, and you wave. Instead of waving your fist, you wave your hand. And the only thing that's changed is that perception of, hey, I know Bob. He's not such a bad guy. I'm going to cut him some slack. What if we did that in our business relationships? What if we assumed the best rather than the worst? What if we gave other people the same benefit of the doubt that we like to give ourselves? I mean, we all have reasons for what we do, right? Well, I had a terrible drive-in, and there was a traffic accident, and I'm late, and my kid's failing math, and my wife's mad at me because I didn't get the yard mowed this weekend. We always have those justifications, but when we meet somebody that isn't happy or who's short or who's negative, we tend to assume the worst about them. Well, they're just a jerk, or they're just not a nice human being. Well, we all have that potential, and so I try to, and it's hard, it's hard to do, but I try to give people the same benefit of the doubt that I give myself.
Right. No, but it's, and I think there's a line in your book that says that it's really about giving rather than what you're looking to get out of someone. So the people who give are great customer service people, and I wish to see that more in the kind of the leadership ranks of some companies, because that's where it begins a lot of times. And so those are great concepts. Dan, Liz, do you guys have any kind of final questions for Mark?
Yeah, as Mark was going through the acronym and talking about how companies can find and develop Freds, and thinking back to the original Fred, I don't think he went through a training program in order to become,
No.
who he was. What was it about him? Was it his family, his upbringing? He seems, we sort of think of him as an anomaly, but yet there are other people out there that are like that. What did you discover in his background that really created that philosophy in his life?
That's an excellent question, Dan, because I often had the same question, and I made some assumptions that proved not to be correct. One time I asked Fred, I said, Fred, you must have had a great family of origin. Your parents must have been wonderful people for you to turn out as you did. And he shared with me, and it's in Fred 2.0, and he shared with permission, so I'm not talking out of school. He said, my parents were very self-centered and very mean-spirited. And I kind of became who I was in reaction to that, not because I wanted to be like that. Fred was always an industrious guy. Even as a young person, he used to hold various odd jobs so that he could afford to go to college. And at one point, certainly it's a sad part of Fred's story, his parents used the money that he had saved working to buy furniture for themselves. So it wasn't like Fred came from this bucolic kind of a background that, he had this great example of what to be. He basically decided he didn't want to be that way, and he used what was bad for good. The reason I tell people that is, it's all about how you deal with what you've got. If you've got great parents and they taught you well, you're a lucky person. Thank them profusely and learn the lessons. If you've got an environment that is negative and you want to get out of it, then you're going to have to basically make different choices you're going to have to become the opposite of what the people in that environment is. And I think that's what's fascinating is Fred didn't have any great breaks, and he didn't have any great role models, but he somehow figured out how to become an incredible human being just with his own thoughtfulness and his own desire to be better as a result of that.
That's good to know.
Liz, you got any last question for Mark?
One last question. We don't want to. We could go down the rabbit hole with this one, but kind of short and sweet. As companies are trying to develop Freds in their organizations, they want their employees to treat their clients this way. But the piece of the puzzle that I often see missing is that they often forget that employees tend to treat customers the way leaders treat employees. And I just wanted your input on that.
Well, it's a great observation, and it is very difficult to treat employees badly and expect them to treat clients or customers well. That's just nonsensical. And yet sometimes, people think that they can demand or cajole or, beat employees into providing great service. By the way, my automatic light just went off. It wasn't like a thundercloud passed over here.
We can still see you, so you're good. Yeah.
Some of you thought you were suffering from instant glaucoma, but it's not. It's just the automatic light in my office. Yeah, I think it goes back to that idea of demonstrating to your employees how you want them to treat each other and how you want them to treat clients. I think increasingly people get it that you've got to have that consistency internally if you're going to deliver that kind of service externally.
Great. Well, I think, Mark, we took a lot of out of this show, very valuable lessons that you've expanded on beyond the Fred Factor books and your speeches. We definitely, I know our audience will have added value into what you just shared because it hits companies, it hits businesses, and just plain old life relationships with our family and friends. So thank you so much for your time for being on our show.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And if anyone would like to get more information about my work, I blog every week, at least once or twice a week. I blog with 4 other experts in the 5 Friends blog. They can access that at marksanborn.com. And of course, as Dan knows, I have an active Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn account as well. So I look forward to connecting with anyone that might have some questions or just want some good ideas.
Great, and also in addition, he's got some great videos on his website as well as YouTube that I encourage everybody. I still, it's a life learning about customer service and other topics that Mark is sharing about leadership, which is amazing material. So great stuff. So thank you so much for being on this show. You can catch this at your leisure, but great valuable stuff. So thank you.
My pleasure. All the best.